Chapter 6. Dear Pap, I think the law is after me now, so I'm going to start for Alaska tomorrow. I meant to ask Mr. Abrasado if he had a map, but I had to whip up on him for talking mean about you. I'm afraid if I go back again, the law will be there waiting for me. Before I left, he gave me some money, and I added it to the money that you already had in the box. I don't know how much it is because I haven't counted it, but I didn't have to sell your watch. You said you might have a brother, but I know you would have told me about that. He said you might have let me die if it was me that had broken my leg, but I know that's not true either. I'm trying to listen to the sounds outside, but I don't think I'm as good at it as you are. I went out to take a leak a few minutes ago, and there was a coon swimming around in the curing barrel. You'd have thought I'd have heard that. I wasn't lonely today, but I am tonight. I wish there was someone else out here to talk to. Maybe you can talk to me soon if you get a chance. Love, Moon. That night, I started a small fire in the wood stove and burned the letter. After the letter was just ashes, I put out the fire so that no one would see the smoke. The only light left was that of the grease lamp we'd made in a can that flickered and put shadows in the walls. I wonder if I'd ever have a place as nice when I got to Alaska. When I tried to imagine what the person I would live with looked like, I wondered if any boys my age were there. I felt the loneliness creeping over me and lay on the hide pile with my jacket covering me and my hat pulled down low. I hugged my knees to my chest and listened to the night sounds. Eventually, the grease lamp went out, and it was so dark that I couldn't see my hands in the front of my face. At one point, I heard something moving outside, and fear bolted through me, and I hugged my knees tighter. It wasn't like me to be scared of creatures moving in the night, but it wasn't myself with all the loneliness. But I wasn't myself with all the loneliness in that dark hole. Pap, I whispered, thinking that maybe he was out there. Maybe he was going to talk to me and make me feel okay again. I took off my hat so I could hear better and held my breath and listened. Whatever creature had been moving outside stopped. Pap, can you hear me? I heard the creature scurry off through the leaves. Then I started thinking about the good times I'd had with Pap when we swim in the creek and make flutter mills and scratch tic-tac-toe in the dirt. All these memories poured in on me like a waterfall until I was shaking and crying. Then I couldn't take it anymore and leaped off the hide pile and ran out into the night. Stop, I cried after the creature. Even if it was just a coon or an armadillo, I wanted something to be with me that night. Don't leave, come back. But my shouts made the rest of the forest creatures duck away and grow silent. I was left standing in the clearing with only the sound of the wind in the treetops. When I imagined that the law was all around me, I started breathing hard and staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Suddenly, I was running as fast as I could. Spider webs covered my face, and tree branches slapped my cheeks. Every time I thought about slowing, I imagined people running behind me. I wasn't taking any trail that I knew of, but following the gaps in the trees. Sometimes the ground would fall from under me and I'd roll down a hill only to get back up at the bottom and keep going. I crashed through a creek and climbed up a steep bank by clutching tree roots. At the top of the bank was a clearing that I dashed across and then ran on again beneath the tall pines. Eventually, it broke from the trees into the lawyer's new road. It felt better to have clear space around me, where I could see that nothing was hidden and watching me. I started down the road, and the air whistled past my ears, and my moccasins padded on the soft dirt. I kept on until the new lodge rose in front of me. The sight of it made me stop and stare up at the windows in the second floor. Hello, I said, but not loud enough for anyone to hear. The lodge was dark except for one lit room in the corner. I stepped sideways across the clearing and saw a man sitting in the room reading a book. I sucked in deep breaths to calm myself, the way I always did before I pulled the trigger on a rifle, and my panic began to go away. It made me feel better to watch the man, even though I didn't know him and didn't want him to know I was outside. I could see there was at least one person in the world besides me. I sat across against a tree at the edge of the clearing. The wind rustled the treetops and reminded me that I'd left the shelter without my jacket and hat. I pulled up my knees to keep warm and watched the room. It was just breaking day when I opened my eyes and saw the man standing over me with a rifle. I leaped to my feet and stared at him. What are you doing out here? He said. I was too startled to reply. Are you lost? I shook my head. You're the boy who buried his father, aren't you? The constable's been out here looking for you. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't say you did. I was just about to step off into the woods and do a little hunting. I saw you sitting here. I'll go now. He put his rifle over his shoulder and motioned towards the lodge. Come on inside. I'll fix you something to eat. I can go hunting tomorrow. I better not. The law is going to be after me soon. I've got a chime that goes off if anyone drives through my gate. I'll know if somebody comes for you. Besides, from what those surveys said, it would take an Indian chief to find your shelter. I don't know what a chime was, but it made me feel better to hear that the constable wasn't close. Are you Mr. Wellington? I am. I got scared out here there last night. I shouldn't be here. Do you like sweet rolls? I never had any. Let's go get some then. I've got one left on the counter that I didn't eat. I thought about it and watched his face. I didn't know Mr. Wellington, but my lonely sickness was less at the sight of him. I didn't see anything in his expression that told me I shouldn't trust him, and I still needed someone to tell me about getting to Alaska. Even though my instincts were against it, I stood and followed him. Once we entered the lodge, I saw Mr. Wellington better in the light. He wore fancy hunting pants and a hat with a turkey feather in it. His face was tight and clean for someone his age. The only way you could tell he was older than Pap was by his eyes. They looked tired past his silver hair. The lodge was warm inside and smelled of cut cedar and pine. The ceiling was high, and I saw the second story was just windows halfway up the wall. I followed him into the kitchen, where he gave me a napkin and a sweet roll off the counter. I bit into it, and the sugar tasted so good that I almost closed my eyes while I chewed. I followed him into a larger room just outside the kitchen. Sit down in that chair over there, he said. His hand pointed in a wooden chair against the wall. I was disappointed that it wasn't one of the softest chairs in the middle of the room, but I went over to it and sat. Mr. Wellington walked around in front of me and pulled up another, more comfortable chair and sat down. He crossed his arms on his chest. I finished the sweet roll and looked around at the light fixtures and the nature paintings on the wall. I talked to that friend of yours who owns a store up the road, and he said that you all have been out here for about 8 years. He's not my friend, I said. Okay. Pap said he'd run us off, I said. Well, I just wanted to find out who was living on my property. I studied a painting of an Indian kneeling by a waterfall and didn't respond. The survey said they found a primitive dwelling of some sort. I suppose that was yours. It's a shelter. It's built like that so people won't find it. I see. What kind of pants are those? Beaver breeches. Did your father make those for you? No, sir, I made 'em. Made a deerskin hat, too, but I left it at home. Interesting. Mr. Wellington must have seen me look over at his television because he said, Would you like me to turn it on for you? I watched his face to see if I could read anything in it. I thought about how lonely it was back at the shelter. I thought about how warm and dry it felt inside the lodge. You going to call the constable on me if I stay? Mr. Wellington paused for a moment. No, I'm not going to call the constable. I'm not sure I like his kind. Can you tell me how to get to Alaska? I probably can. I may have some maps in one of those back rooms. Why don't you sit in this chair right here while I see what I can find? I looked at the soft chair he was pointing to. Okay. Mr. Wellington turned on the television and then walked away. I'll be back shortly, he said. I only seen television a few times. Mr. Abascato had a set in his store over the counter. I got up and moved over to the cushioned chair and sank down into my chin, touched my chest. I'd never felt a more comfortable chair in my life. There was a show about lions playing. I'd only seen them in picture books and couldn't take my eyes off them. Daylight soon slipped through the windows and I grew groggy and lazy. An hour must have gone by when I heard someone knocking on the door. Mr. Wellington walked out of one of the back rooms and went to answer the knock. When he opened the door, I saw a man in a suit standing there. I knew right away that he was there to get me. It was how he looked at me when he stepped inside. I leaped from my chair and ran towards the back rooms where Mr. Wellington had gone earlier. But as soon as I reached the hall, a man in overalls stepped out and grabbed me from behind. He pulled me to his chest and bear hugged me so that I couldn't do anything but kick. I kicked backwards at his knees, so he had to walk me into the main room with his legs spread. He took me over to the man who had come for me and held me out. He's all yours if you can hold him, the man in the overalls said. Mr. Hill's my caretaker, Mr. Wellington said to the man in the suit. He came in through the back door. We figured the boy would make a run for it. I appreciate the help, the man in the suit said. I looked at Mr. Wellington. Liar! I yelled at him. Mr. Jean's not the constable, Mr. Wellington said calmly. He's from the boys' home. He'll treat you a lot better than that constable I met yesterday. Take it easy, Mr. Jean said. Nobody's going to hurt you, Moon. I started bucking, kicking, and pounding my arms against Mr. Hill. I thought I was about to slip out once, but he joggled me back up and squeezed me tighter. Boy needs a bath and a haircut, Mr. Hill said. I can't stand the smell of him. I didn't do anything wrong, I yelled. Moon, Mr. Jean shouted. Kicked at the air again. I haven't done anything to anybody. Moon, calm down. Just bring him outside and put him in the car. We'll take him to the home and get him cleaned up. Mr. Jean hurried to the car and opened the back door while Mr. Hill carried me behind him, and Mr. Wellington followed. When we reached the car, Mr. Hill leaned over and shoved me in. Before I could turn around, I heard the door slam shut behind me. It only took a second to look up and see that there were no handles and a plastic shield behind me in the front seat. I knew I was trapped. Liar! I yelled at the floor. I'd never been in a car. The only time I had ridden in anything was when Pap came down with a fever once in the way to Mr. Abrascado's store. He let Mr. Abrascado ride us in the back of his pickup truck to place up the road, where we went on foot the rest of the way to the shelter. But it was different then. We were in a truck bed and where the fresh air brushed our faces. It wasn't much at all like being shut up. It was more like flying. I lay down and pulled my knees up. The three men talked outside for a few minutes, and then Mr. Jean got in and started the engine. My ears were pressed to the vinyl seat, and I could soon hear the dirt road passing under the tires. After a minute, I felt the car slow and swing onto the highway. I grew woozy as I listened to the hum of the asphalt. I tried holding my breath to make it go away. You can sit up, you know. I didn't answer. I stared at the back of Mr. Dean's seat and concentrated on the queasiness in my stomach. After a moment, I heard him turn. You okay back there? I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I heard the crunch of gravel as the car slowed and pulled onto the side of the road. I heard Mr. Jean's door open. A steady ding sound came from the front part of the car. My door opened, and Mr. Jean grabbed me by the shoulder and shook me gently. I felt the contents of my stomach lunge forward and spatter against the back of his car seat. Gah! He yelled as he jumped away. He jerked me out and dragged me down into a grassy ditch, where he held me under one armpit and let my head dangle. I stared at the ground and thought of nothing except how grateful I was to be out of the car. I breathed the fresh air and felt my stomach easing. Are you done? I didn't answer. I moved my eyes and stared at the tips of his shiny leather shoes. He shifted his feet. Are you feeling better? I thought about it. I felt better. My stomach was back to normal. I let my eyes creep slowly past the tips of his shoes and up his pant leg. Then I looked down at my left hand, which rested in one slightly bent knee. I remembered something Pep had told me. Moon, there's no faster way to take a man down than to punch him between the legs with everything you've got. If that doesn't work, take a stick to him. I took a deep breath, balled my fist, and socked him in the crotch. Before I even looked up, he let go of me. I jerked away and took two quick steps towards the car. Mr. Jean drew himself inwards like a turtle. He closed his eyes and sank to the ground and rolled over onto his side. He pulled his knees in tight as a baby and moaned curses at me. Don't you even think about running off. I looked in both directions on the road. It was empty. I wiped my mouth on my shoulder, crossed the blacktop, and ran into the forest.